Let me begin today with something that may feel a little unsettling. All your life you were taught to accumulate. Accumulate knowledge, accumulate money, accumulate achievements, accumulate respect, accumulate roles. Success, as most of us learned it, meant adding more responsibility, more recognition, more people depending on you. If you grew up in America, whether in Arizona, Ohio, California, or the Carolinas, you know this story well. We were raised to believe that a meaningful life is a life that keeps building upward and outward. A bigger house, a stronger reputation, a family that looks to you for direction. Adding meant growing. Adding meant winning. But I want you to pause with me for just a moment. What if the highest form of wisdom is not addition, but subtraction? What if aging is not loss but liberation disguised as loss? I know that may sound strange. Because when retirement comes, when the phone rings less often, when the title disappears from your name, it can feel like something is being taken away. And somewhere inside, a quiet question arises. Am I becoming less valuable? You may not say it out loud, but you felt it. Many of the older students I've spoken with over the years have confessed that this is their deepest, most private fear. Not illness, not even death, but irrelevance. And here's where the great reversal begins. In psychology, there is something called identity attachment. We attach our sense of worth to the roles we play: parent, provider, leader, caregiver, problem solver. But what happens when those roles begin to fall away? The ego feels threatened. It interprets change as decline. Yet in Buddhist wisdom, something very different is suggested. You were never those roles. They were garments. Necessary garments, honorable garments, but garments nonetheless. And aging, strangely enough, may be the season when life gently removes those layers, not to diminish you, but to free you. I want you to imagine something. If tomorrow no one needed you to fix anything, if no one expected you to carry the emotional weight of the family, if you no longer had to prove your competence to anyone, who would you be? Perhaps this stage of life is not about fading. Perhaps it is about being unmasked. You are not losing your value. You are being released from the performance. And maybe, just maybe, what feels like loss is actually the doorway to the most honest version of yourself you have ever met. I leave you with this question today. If life is taking away your roles, could it be returning you to your true self? Part 1. The death of the social self. Let us go a little deeper now. What many people call aging is in truth something far more intimate. It is the quiet death of the social self. Not your body, not your spirit, but the identity you built in the eyes of others. Psychology tells us that identity is not something we are born with fully formed. It is something we construct over time. We gather stories, we collect labels, we attach meaning to roles. I am a provider. I am the strong one. I am the responsible one. I am the one everyone calls when things fall apart. Each of these becomes a thread. And over decades, those threads weave together into a narrative, the story of who you believe yourself to be. And here is the subtle truth. The mind confuses the story with the self. When retirement comes, when children no longer need guidance in the same way, when decisions are made without consulting you first, something startling happens. The narrative begins to loosen, and when the narrative loosens, the ego panics. This is what psychologists sometimes describe as identity destabilization. The structure that once provided orientation begins to collapse. It feels like standing in a familiar room that suddenly has no walls. That is why retirement can feel like shock, even if you were financially prepared for it. Because what is collapsing is not your schedule, it is your storyline. Let me ask you something gently. If no one needed you tomorrow, if there were no responsibilities attached to your name, if there were no roles left to perform, what would remain? Sit with that for a moment. You may notice discomfort, perhaps even fear. That discomfort is not weakness. It is simply the ego realizing it cannot anchor itself in external function anymore. Now here's where Buddhist wisdom offers something profoundly liberating. The Buddha spoke of anatta, often translated as no fixed self, not meaning you do not exist, but meaning that what you call self is not a solid, permanent entity. It is a process, a flow. In early Buddhist teaching, the human experience is described as 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. None of them alone is you. They arise, shift, dissolve. The self you have been protecting for 70 years is not a statue carved in stone. It is more like a costume worn for a particular act in a long play. And when the act ends, the costume is gently removed. The self you are grieving was only a costume. That may sound confronting at first, but stay with me. If the role was a costume, then what you truly are must be something deeper, something that existed before the role and remains after it. When you were a child, before titles, before responsibilities, there was awareness. When you became a parent, that awareness remained. When you became a professional, that awareness remained. Roles changed, awareness did not. And perhaps the stage of life is not about clinging to the costume, but rediscovering the quiet awareness underneath it. Let me offer you a simple practice. Tonight or sometime this week, sit quietly. No television, no phone, no music, and gently ask yourself, who am I without my story? Not with force, not with anxiety, just curiosity. Notice what arises. Maybe silence, maybe restlessness, maybe relief. You do not need to solve the question, just let it echo inside you. Because the end of the social self is not the end of you. It is the beginning of meeting yourself without a script. And I leave you with this today. If the story is fading, are you brave enough to discover the one who was never the story at all? Part 2. From being needed to being peace. Let's talk about something tender now. For many of you watching, your identity has not only been built around work, it has been built around family, especially your children. If you are a parent, you understand this deeply. There was a time when your presence meant safety, your decisions meant direction, your strength meant survival, and somewhere along the way a quiet belief formed. I must always help my children. It sounds noble. It sounds loving, but I want to gently explore something with you. Is helping always the same as loving? Or sometimes, is it control dressed up as care? Now please hear me clearly. This is not criticism. This is compassion. When we spend decades being needed, our nervous system becomes accustomed to that role. In psychology, we know something called emotional contagion theory, the idea that emotions transfer between people. Families regulate one another unconsciously. When a parent is anxious, children absorb it. When a parent is calm, children settle. Your presence has always shaped the emotional climate of your home. But here's the shift that happens later in life. Your adult children no longer need your constant correction. They no longer need you to solve every problem. They need something else. They need your calm. Let me say that again. Children do not need your control. They need your calm. When you try to hold everything together, you are like a rope pulled tight between 2 posts, always straining, always adjusting tension. But maybe your role is no longer to be the rope. Maybe you are meant to become the sky. The sky does not control the birds. It allows them to fly. Non-attachment in Buddhist teaching does not mean indifference. It does not mean withdrawing love. It means loving without possession, caring without gripping. There is a difference between saying, I trust you, and secretly believing, without me, you will fail. Can you feel that difference? Sometimes when parents grow older, anxiety increases, not because the children are incapable, but because the parent's identity was built on being indispensable. And when that indispensability softens, fear arises. I once spoke with a woman in her late 70s who said, "If I stop worrying about my son, what will I do with all that energy?" It was an honest question. She wasn't really afraid for her son. She was afraid of losing the role of protector. But here is what I gently told her. Your adult children do not need your vigilance. They need your steadiness. When your nervous system is regulated, when you are at peace, you become a refuge. And a peaceful parent is one of the greatest blessings a family can receive. Let me offer you a small experiment. The next time your child shares a problem, resist the urge to advise immediately. Instead, breathe, listen, and silently bless them in your heart. You might say quietly to yourself, "May you find your wisdom." Notice what happens inside you. Notice the urge to fix. Notice the discomfort of not stepping in. And then notice the space that opens. Compassion without possession is a higher form of love. You are not withdrawing from your children. You are trusting them. And perhaps more importantly, you are trusting yourself enough to let go. Because at this stage of life, your greatest contribution is no longer control. It is presence. And I leave you with this question today. If you stop trying to hold your family together, could your calm become the invisible strength that truly supports them? Part 3. From regret to radiance. Now we come to something even more delicate. Regret. If there is one companion that tends to visit more often in the later decades of life, it is memory. Not just pleasant memory, but the unfinished ones, the sharp ones, the ones that wake you at 3 a.m., a decision you wish you had made differently, a word you wish you had not spoken, a risk you wish you had taken, a relationship that ended poorly, and the mind begins to whisper, "If only." In Buddhist teaching, there's a story about 2 arrows. The first arrow is the pain of what happened. The second arrow is the suffering we create by replaying it. But I want to go even deeper with you. Regret is memory without compassion. That is all it is. Psychology has a term called the rumination loop. It is when the brain keeps replaying past events in an attempt to rewrite them. The default mode network, the part of the brain active when we are not focused on a task, tends to anchor identity in narrative memory. And as we age, with more quiet time, that network grows louder. The mind says, "This mistake defines you." But let me ask you something gently. If you could go back and change it, would you truly be wiser than the person you were then? Think carefully. At that moment in time, you made the best decision you could with the awareness you had. Not the awareness you have now. The awareness you had then. In Buddhist wisdom, ignorance is not a moral failure. It is simply the natural state before understanding matures. Awareness grows in layers, like rings in a tree. You cannot demand that a younger version of yourself possess the clarity that only decades of living could produce. That would be unfair. And yet we do this to ourselves constantly. We judge our past self with the consciousness of our present self. That is not wisdom. That is cruelty. I once met a man in his early 80s who carried guilt about leaving a job opportunity in his 30s. He believed it cost his family financial stability. For 50 years he replayed that choice. When I asked him, at 35, "Did you know what you know now?" He paused, and he said quietly, "No, I was scared." Exactly, he was human, and so were you. The fire of experience leaves ash behind, but ash is not waste. Ash fertilizes the soil. Without the mistakes, without the misjudgments, without the failures, you would not possess the humility and insight you carry today. The very regrets you are ashamed of shaped the compassion you now feel for others. They softened you. They humbled you. They expanded you. So what if, instead of treating regret like a wound to reopen, you treated it like a teacher? Let me offer you something practical. Take a piece of paper. Write down one regret you still carry. Just one. Look at it. And instead of arguing with it, bow your head slightly and say quietly, "You taught me." Notice what shifts. Not denial, not justification. Recognition. Because the past is not asking for punishment. It is asking for integration. The radiance of later life does not come from a flawless history. It comes from a digested one. When memory is wrapped in compassion, it stops burning and begins illuminating. And so I leave you with this today. If your past mistakes helped grow the wisdom you now hold, could it be that nothing in your life was wasted after all? Part 4. From Loneliness to Sacred Solitude. There's a fear that many people do not speak about openly. It is not the fear of death. It is not even the fear of illness. It is the fear of being alone. As the years pass, circles grow smaller. Friends move away, some pass on. Children build lives of their own. The house becomes quieter, and in that quiet, something uncomfortable can surface. Loneliness. Now, most advice you hear will say, don't be afraid of being alone. But I want to offer you something stronger than that. Solitude is where the false self starves and the true self breathes. There's a profound difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness says, I am incomplete without someone else. Solitude says, I am whole, even in silence. Psychology tells us that attachment patterns formed early in life often resurface in later years. If you grew up fearing abandonment, that fear can quietly return when life slows down. The nervous system remembers what it once felt. When the external noise fades, unresolved attachment can rise to the surface. And so the mind says, I must stay busy. I must stay connected. I must not sit too long in silence. But what if silence is not the enemy? In Buddhist tradition, especially among forest monks, solitude was not punishment. It was medicine. They would go into the forest not to escape the world, but to meet themselves without distraction. They practiced what is called noble silence, not merely refraining from speech, but allowing the internal noise to settle. And something beautiful happens when the wind stops moving across a lake. The surface becomes still. And when the lake is still, it reflects the moon perfectly. Your mind is that lake. For decades it has been stirred by schedules, obligations, conversations, television, responsibility. But in this season of life, when the wind's quiet, reflection becomes possible. Let me ask you gently, when was the last time you sat in a room without turning something on, without checking your phone, without filling the air? Does silence make you restless? If it does, that is not failure. That is simply the false self, the one that depends on activity and validation, feeling hungry. Because the false self survives on noise, the true self survives on presence. I once spoke with a widower in his 70s who told me that evenings were the hardest. The house felt heavy, the silence felt accusatory. So I asked him to try something unusual. Instead of fighting the quiet, sit with it intentionally. 10 minutes. No phone, no television. Just sit. Feel the room. Notice the way the air rests on your skin. Notice the subtle sounds. Perhaps a refrigerator humming, the distant sound of traffic, the rhythm of your own breath. At first, he told me it felt unbearable. But after several weeks, something shifted. He said it doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels spacious. That word matters. Spacious. Sacred solitude is not isolation. It is intimacy with your own existence. Non-attachment does not mean rejecting connection. It means not clinging to it out of fear. And perhaps in this stage of life, you're being invited into a deeper companionship with yourself. The world does not need you to fear the quiet. It needs you to discover what is revealed within it. So tonight, I invite you to try something simple. 10 minutes, no phone, no background noise. Just sit. Let the lake settle, and see what begins to reflect. And I leave you with this today. If silence feels uncomfortable, could it be because you are finally close enough to hear your true self breathing? Part 5. Becoming the sky. Now we come to the heart of it. Up until now, we have spoken about roles falling away, about control softening, about regret transforming, about silence becoming sacred. But all of that is preparing you for something deeper, a shift in identity. For many years, perhaps you have thought of yourself like a tree. Rooted, defined, fixed in place, strong, yes, but still rooted in one position. Today, I want to offer you a different image. You are not the tree. You are the sky. Let that sink in. You are not the clouds of regret that pass through your mind. You are not the storms of fear that occasionally gather. You are not even the bright moments of pride or success. You are the sky that holds them. In Buddhist wisdom, awareness is often described as space. Not space as emptiness in a negative sense, but space as capacity. The ability to allow everything to arise and pass without being damaged by it. Emptiness does not mean nothingness. It means openness. Psychologically, there is a concept called cognitive diffusion. It is the ability to step back from your thoughts and see them as events in the mind rather than absolute truth. Instead of saying, "I am a failure," you begin to notice, "I am having the thought that I am a failure." Do you see the difference? That small space between you and the thought, that is freedom. And meta-awareness, awareness of awareness, allows you to observe emotions without drowning in them. You are not the fear. You are the one who notices the fear. You are not the regret. You are the one who is aware of regret. Clouds change shape constantly. Storms gather and dissolve, but the sky remains untouched. Have you ever looked up after a violent storm? The sky was never harmed. The storm did not stain it. It simply moved through. For decades, you may have mistaken the clouds for yourself. I am anxious. I am lonely. I am no longer important. But what if those are only weather patterns passing across something vast and steady? Let me ask you something slowly. Before you were a parent, before you were a worker, before you were a success or a failure, what were you? Long silence here. You were awareness. As a child lying on the grass, staring at the clouds, there was awareness. When you held your first job, awareness. When you fell in love, awareness. When you lost someone, awareness. Roles changed, circumstances changed, thoughts changed, but awareness remained. This is the great dignity of aging. As the clouds thin out, as the storms slow, you begin to recognize the sky itself. You begin to recognize that what you truly are cannot be reduced to biography. You are not the resume of your life. You are the open field in which the resume appeared. And perhaps this is why, in later years, there's a subtle spaciousness available that was not accessible in youth. Because now you can see the weather more clearly. You no longer have to chase every cloud. You no longer have to fear every storm. You can rest as the sky. And so I leave you with this today. If you are not the passing clouds of your life, are you willing to discover the vastness that has always been quietly holding them? Part 6. Living radiantly before sunset. Now, my dear friends, let us not end softly. Let us end awake. There's a quiet misunderstanding in our culture, especially here in America, that aging is a slow dimming, that life peaks somewhere in midlife, and everything after that is maintenance, decline, endurance. But have you ever truly watched a sunset? Not glanced at it, watched it. The evening sky is the most beautiful part of the day, not because it tries to shine, but because it has nothing left to prove. In the morning, the sun rises with urgency. At noon, it stands overhead with intensity. But in the evening, it softens. It expands. It paints the entire horizon. There is no striving in a sunset. There is only radiance. And I want to tell you something clearly. You are not fading. You are distilling. Distilling means the unnecessary has burned away. The need to compete. The need to impress. The need to explain yourself to people who misunderstand you. What remains now is essence. When wine ages, it does not become weaker. It becomes refined. Its complexity deepens. Its notes become subtle and rich. The later decades of your life are not about expansion outward. They are about refinement inward. You have nothing left to prove. That sentence alone can feel like freedom. For so long you proved yourself through work, through sacrifice, through endurance, through providing, through fixing. Now perhaps life is inviting you to live, not as performance but as presence. And presence is powerful. I have seen men and women in their 70s and 80s become the emotional center of their families, not because they give advice, but because they radiate steadiness. When they enter a room, the room settles, not because they demand respect, but because they are no longer fighting anything inside themselves. That is radiance. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. So here is the gentle challenge. Do not spend your final decades defending a story. Do not spend them trying to convince the world you were right. Do not spend them replaying who you used to be. Spend them dissolving into freedom. Freedom from the old narrative. Freedom from proving. Freedom from gripping. Let the sunset color your sky. Laugh more easily. Forgive more quickly. Sit longer in silence. Call someone just to bless them. Walk slowly without feeling behind. Because the most beautiful season of your life may not be behind you. It may be this one, if you allow it. We cannot stop the river of time. None of us can, but we do not have to drown in it either. We do not stop the river. We learn to become the sky above it. And so I leave you with this today. If nothing is left to prove, how beautifully are you willing to live the rest of your days?